How many here want to be used as a guinea pig to test the health safety of a new food manufactured product? Well, you may have no choice when you walk into the local supermarket and buy cloned meat which isn't labeled. There needs to be labels on cloned meat so that consumers are aware of what is inside and how the food which they are eating was produced. We are all consumers, and we either eat meat or know loved ones who eat meat, and so this affects all of us to know how the food in our local supermarkets was produced. I have done research into cloned meat, and I would like to share with you a few of the facts which I have learned. First, we will explore the problem of the lack of labels on cloned meat. Second, we will look at two underlying causes behind the problem. And lastly, we will consider a policy to implement to fix this dilemma. Meat that is derived from cloned animals is not being required labeling. This current policy deprives us as consumers of the ability to know how our food was produced. First, I want to tell you a bit about animal cloning. According to an article on the official FDA website, last updated January 15, 2008, animal cloning has been around for more than 20 years. The website also states that the most common form of animal cloning is a process called somatic cell nuclear transfer. In the first step of this process, scientists take an egg from a female animal. They then remove the gene-containing nucleus from the egg. Second, they take an animal which the breeder wishes to clone, and they take a cell from that animal and add it to the egg. After more work in the lab, the egg is formed into an embryo. This embryo is then implanted into a surrogate female animal that carries the embryo to term and gives birth to a clone. According to the Environmental Nutrition, published March 2008, the FDA approved on January 15, 2008, they announced that cloned meat from cattle, pigs, and goats were safe for human consumption. They not only deemed the food to be safe to eat, but also deemed it unnecessary that cloned food should be labeled as such. However, many question the safety of cloned meat and the FDA's decision. According to the Environmental Health Source book published 2009, it provides the following information. Animals that are cloned have a higher rate of genetic abnormalities than conventionally reproduced animals. It also states Dolly, the first sheep who was cloned, died just 6 years after birth from premature arthritis and lung disease. Dolly, however, is not alone. Most cloned animals die immediately after birth. The source book also says that the FDA did not look at the long-term health effects of consuming cloned meat. Eating genetically abnormal clones could cause human health abnormalities, which could lead to cancer and other late-onset degenerative diseases. Business Week Online, published January 15, 2008, states that the studies which the FDA reviewed were too general. They looked only at simple things like the fat and protein content within the cloned meat instead of more complex things like the composition of fatty acids. The International Journal of Pharmaceutical and Healthcare Marketing, published 2009, states that there simply isn't enough information on the long-term health effects of cloned meat, and it even hints that such meat could cause neurological diseases in humans that won't surface for decades. Aside from these health concerns, there are also for some moral concerns. Many people view cloning itself as a morally wrong practice, whether due to their religious beliefs or their concern for animal rights. I personally do not feel comfortable eating meat that was cloned and do not wish to support companies promoting cloning practices. Because of these potential health risks and moral convictions, consumers have the right to know how their food was produced, and the fact that cloned meat is not being required labeling is a serious problem. This current policy deprives us as consumers the ability to protect our health and make right decisions. Now that you understand some of the problem associated with the lack of labeling on cloned meat, let me tell you about two underlying causes behind this problem. The first cause we already touched upon a bit. According to their official website, the FDA spent 5 years studying hundreds of reports on cloned animal livestock, and they concluded that meat from cloned cattle, pigs, and goats was safe for human consumption. They also concluded that it was unnecessary to label cloned meat because they found no science-based reason to distinguish cloned meat from non-cloned meat. The second cause is public awareness. Not much of the public is aware of the potential long-term health risks of cloned meat, so they have been, because of this unawareness, we haven't been really raising our voices to the FDA and our local officials to change the policy. Now that we understand two underlying causes behind the problem, let's look at a policy to fix this dilemma. The policy is very simple. There needs to be regulation on the meat industry and companies that use cloned animals for meat. The FDA needs to implement a federal mandate on the meat industry to require labelings. The labels should be placed on the front of packaging large enough for the consumer to recognize. They don't have to be complex. They can simply state that the meat is cloned or derived from a clone's offspring. This simple label will enable consumers to know how their food was produced and also enable them to make their own decision about the meat. We already have laws enforcing nutritional data labels on food, and a law enforcing a label on cloned meat will work just as well. However, those who promote cloned meat argue that if we put labels on cloned meat that say cloned or clone-free, this will cause the public to perceive that there's something inherently wrong with cloned meat. They believe that their meat is perfectly as fine as the meat that we eat today. However, although this argument sounds valid, the long-term health effects of cloned meat are still uncertain. And also, it doesn't matter what kind of perception labels will cause on the sales of the meat, the public still has a right to know how their food was produced. We all have a right to protect ourselves, and we should all be voicing our opinions to the FDA about cloned meat. And maybe we can influence them to change their policy and reconsider reconsider labels on cloned meat. If the FDA will listen, you can always contact your local congressman and ask them to pass a state bill requiring cloned meat to be labeled at our local supermarkets. Hopefully you now have a better understanding of the problem associated with the lack of labels on cloned meat and understand the policy to fix it. First, I told you about the problem. Second, I told you two underlying causes behind the problem. And lastly, I explained to you my policy to fix this problem. We don't have to be involuntary guinea pigs testing some new method of production. And we could take our health into our own hands.